When I first started thinking about this podcast series about a year ago, I hoped that one of my first guests would be Carla Rinaldi, the longtime leader of the Reggio Children Foundation in Reggio Emilia, Italy. Like many others, I've been deeply impressed and inspired by the preschools and kindergartens in Reggio Emilia. In Reggio classrooms, children's imagination, curiosity, and creativity are always respected and always nurtured. Watching children create, play, share, and learn in Reggio kindergartens, I felt that all people of all ages should have the opportunity to learn in that same way. That's why I decided to call my research group Lifelong Kindergarten. It was Carla Rinaldi who introduced me to the schools of Reggio and who helped me understand and appreciate the ideas and strategies and structures underlying the Reggio approach to learning. Sadly, Carla passed away in April of 2025, so she's not able to join me on this podcast. But I've been thinking a lot about Carla over the past year, and I want to do my best to share Carla's ideas with others. In my conversations with Carla, she was always making connections across boundaries. For Carla, school and community were always intertwined. Art and science were always intertwined. Play and learning were always intertwined. And education and politics were always intertwined. For Carla, educational choices were always political choices. The first schools in Reggio were started in 1945 in reaction to the fascism in Italy. Carla never forgot the political origins of the Reggio schools. Today, 80 years later, as authoritarianism is again on the rise around the world, the ideas and lessons of the Reggio schools are more relevant and more important than ever. Since Carla isn't here for a conversation, I asked Steve Seidel to join me for this podcast episode. Like me, Steve was a close friend of Carla's, and as a researcher at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, he collaborated with the Reggio schools on many projects. My conversation with Steve provided both of us an opportunity to reflect on what makes the Reggio schools so special and what we can do to keep alive the ideas that motivated and animated Carla. As you listen to our conversation, I hope you'll also think about how you might apply some of the ideas from Carla and Reggio in your work and in your life. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the Lifelong Kindergarten podcast.
Hi, Mitch. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Well, I know that you, like me, have been deeply inspired by the schools in Reggio Emilia, Italy, and by the ideas of our dear friend Carla Rinaldi. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you, to share some ideas about, how Reggio and Carla have influenced our work and have influenced our thinking about learning and education.
Well, I am very grateful for the opportunity to think about that, and I appreciate your focus on influence and inspiration. Yeah. I've been deeply influenced and deeply inspired by the work in Reggio.
Yeah, and I know we've both been to Reggio quite a few times, yeah. And I know that for me, I realize it's not possible to talk about the schools of Reggio without talking about the community of Reggio. Yeah. And I've appreciated the way that you've highlighted the relationship between the schools and the community. So maybe we could start off by you just talking a little bit about how you see that relationship between schools and community in Reggio.
Yeah. I was when I first started to go to Reggio, for me, Mitch, this was, I think, in the late 90s. I'm not sure when you started to go to Reggio.
It was also 1999 was my first visit there.
Yeah. I think it's important just to maybe stating the obvious, but I grew up in the United States. I went to American schools. If this is my context. And so arriving in Reggio and starting to go to the preschools was, you could say, a shock to the system. And one of the most immediate and striking things that I I took in when I was there was the relationship that I sensed between the community and the schools. The, there's always a sense of dependence, I think, that you feel in American public schools, that the city and the state are supporting the schools. But there's not much of a feeling of reciprocity or mutuality. And in Reggio, there was this totally striking sense that not only did the schools receive from the town, but the schools give to the town.
You
And
can just
not
walk down Main Street and you see the results of banners of drawings from kids. And
at billboards, the side, entire sides of buildings, and then small things that you wouldn't even notice immediately. But I think about one that I particularly loved was in one of the main parks, and there are small parks all through the town. But in one of the main parks is a giant, giant tree. And if you get close enough to it, you see that there are all these tiny clay sculptures of animals perched in the trees, in the nooks and the crannies of the trees, that were made by children from one of the preschools. It's a gift to the town. You walk through and you think you know where you are, and then all of a sudden you go, wait, something magical is happening here. And
I know one thing that I often heard Carla say was that children are citizens from birth, that they're considered full participants in the community right from birth. And you can see that they're respected and valued the way that they can contribute to the community.
Absolutely. They are major contributors to the cultural life of the city. And that's extraordinary, because in the US you don't that's not the norm. You wait till you grow up to become a contributor to the cultural life of the city. And there are all of these different examples. I mean, you know about the theater curtain, but
Yeah,
you had
right.
some
But that was
direct
one.
experience.
That one really impacted me because it was on my first visit there in 1999. It was when there was a kindergarten class was in the process when I was there of designing a curtain for the opera house in the community. They'd been asked at the beginning of the year. And what was striking to me was not just that children were given this opportunity to design a new curtain for this central cultural location in the community, but also it was this year-long project. Kindergarten students generally do not work on year-long projects.
Right.
And I think everything about that process really struck me. That, the kids spent the first 2 months just spending time around the opera house to understand the area around it. And they became interested in the bugs and the insects around the opera house, as 5-year-olds are likely to do. So they decided they wanted to make the curtain about insects. And in the classroom when I was visiting, they were talking about transformation, of how caterpillars turn into butterflies. So it turns into thinking about how the natural world works as they were doing this wonderful community art project.
And transformation, of course, is a beautiful image and metaphor for theater.
Yeah.
So it's totally wonderful. I remember one of the first projects I ever heard about in Reggio was the amusement park for birds in the yard behind the Valletta School, in which children made fountains and used umbrellas to hanging umbrellas upside down so that they would collect water and the birds could, and all kinds of different spaces for birds to play that they created. And that was a project that was, of course, initiated in many ways and designed by children, but also involved and invited in parents and teachers and others who would help them to do that. And what was created was lasting and an inspiration and a joy to people for years to come. I loved it.
Yeah. I think another connecting thread between those two examples, the opera house curtain and the public fountains where they were creating, in both cases, it was children creating things. And
Yes.
I do think you walk into Reggio classrooms and kids have all these opportunities for creating. And I think for me, that was part of the big inspiration, since for me, it's so important for young people to grow up as creative thinkers. Then they need opportunities to create and express themselves, to develop their voice. And you just see that in the Reggio classroom. You walk into the classroom, there's this incredible diversity of materials that can open up possibilities for all different types of creative experiences.
Yes, it's interesting, Mitch. I hadn't thought about this for a while, but when I left Reggio the first time and was processing what I'd seen, honestly, I couldn't find words for it. It was just so out of the ordinary. I have a background in theater, and in the 1980s, I spent a lot of time in New York working with some avant-garde experimental theater folks. And so got kind of deep into that world. And and after a while of getting back from my first trip, I thought, oh, I get what they're doing. This is avant-garde preschool. This it has all of the markings, as you said, creative work. You're making things all the time. You're making them. Not only are you making them, you're making them to share them with other people. And you are exploring possibilities. You are engaged in this kind of constant, endless experimentation. And it becomes radical in that sense. And, when I think about avant-garde theater in the 80s in New York and the preschools in Reggio Emilia, in Reggio, I saw people experimenting with young children in schools with robotics for the very first time. I'd never seen it in the US at that point, and with computers and young children. But so, exploring and exploiting technology on the one hand, and at the same time, always coming back to the very basic elemental, the elements of life, water, light, clay, leaves, all of these materials from the natural world and the phenomenal
Right.
world.
And bring up the use of technology. I think a thing that inspired me and impressed me was seeing technology just as another material. As you said, clay and water and leaves are present in the classroom. And too often in many classrooms around the world, technology is seen in this very different light, that is delivering instruction or delivering information. And Reggio is really open to seeing technology as just another material for creating things and expressing.
Yeah, I love that. Yes, it's a tool that helps you to you both explore the tool and you use the tool for exploration and experiment.
But maybe for me, this also connects with, again, I took great inspiration from the idea from Reggio about the 100 languages of children. And there's a wonderful poem by Loris Malaguzzi, the original founder of the Reggio schools and a mentor to Carla. And he wrote the poem about the 100 languages. And it really is emphasizing this point about children having so many different ways of expressing themselves, but also the importance for us to support that and to nurture that and to make sure. Actually, I have the poem here. I'm going to read the beginning of the poem just to give a sense of it, where Malaguzzi writes, "The child is made of 100. The child has 100 languages, 100 hands, 100 thoughts, 100 ways of thinking, of playing, of speaking, 100 ways of listening, of marveling, of loving, 100 joys for singing, understanding." So it's just all these different ways that children can express themselves. So for me, I always took that as, first having the respect for their child. The child has all these languages, but also, message to us, make sure how can we support that. So again, since I do a lot with developing technology, I took this to mean when I develop technology, it better be something that the child can use in all of these ways and could be another language or support all of the child's languages.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that the poem does for me, and that the refrain of the 100 languages, I feel like one of the Carla never stopped reminding me of the 100 languages. And there was a moment, Mitch, when I was in Reggio. Carla was taking me to see the new international preschool. There are children from many countries in Reggio Emilia, and they had created a preschool to honor that and respect that. And she showed me a room in which I think there were six or so quite young children between 2 and 3 sitting at a table, and there were all these pieces of white paper, different shapes, sizes, on the table, and they were all playing with them. It looked, well, to use the language of language, it looked kind of incoherent to me. I couldn't make sense of it, but I watched for a while, and then I said to Carla, these children all speak different languages. They're clearly from different countries. And do they, how do they communicate? What's their common language? And she looked at me, and then she looked back at them, and she said, right now they're speaking the language of white paper. And then when I watched, I could see that they were all doing different things with the paper. They were kind of crushing it. They were squeezing it in their hands. They were folding it. They were rolling it. But they were also passing it to each other. They were watching each other and getting ideas about what to do with the paper. If you stayed with them and really not just take that 30-second glance and see a group of kids at a table with paper, but really watch what they were doing, it was clear they were in communication.
Yeah. And they were continuing to develop the language. We can say that children have the language of white paper, but in that classroom, they were further developing their language. They were becoming more fluent in the language of white paper.
Absolutely.
And part of developing fluency is about working with others. And I liked how you mentioned also earlier that there's 2 parts of the social side in Reggio. One is communicating and collaborating with those right around you, but also creating things that then can be social to be shared with others. So I think that is also part of the languages. For me also is about the fluency to communicate and to share. So it's both creating and sharing.
Yes. And, I think, we talk in the U.S. about the function of schooling is to create citizens, right, who are informed, can contribute, etc. The experience of being a child in those schools and seeing whether it's your work or the work of other children, but to see that in the public square, literally, and all over the city, I think about, they knew that children will go to the hospital at times. It's a fact, and that can be a scary and overwhelming experience. They talked about that with the children. They considered what it feels like to go to the hospital or to go to the doctor. They made all kinds of pictures of the things you encounter, like stethoscopes that get put on your body and otoscopes that get put in your ears. And the children made pictures of those. If you go to the pediatric hospital in Reggio, you see these pictures now are, as you come into that building, children see children's drawings of the things they will see and experience in that space. It's a stunning recognition that children have a very particular contribution to make, specifically to their peers, but also to create a different feeling in any public arena, in any of our public institutions.
Yeah. And for me, this idea of the child as citizen and contributing to the community, it also does grow out of the history of Reggio. As we mentioned, the Reggio school started by Lars Malaguzzi was a driving force back in 1945. And it was in reaction to the fascism of Italy and the feeling that we need to produce a new type of citizen, a different type of citizen. And, what can the important role that schools can play in order to make sure that children growing up to be the type of citizens for a democratic, pluralistic society.
Yes, and that means, among other things, that you come to you need to try to come to understand your mutual interdependence as early as possible. And I think you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, but when I went to Reggio because I was working on the Making Learning Visible project through my work at Project Zero, and it was a collaboration. And the kind of key question in that project was how to take a group of individuals. Anytime people come into a classroom, in the first moment, what you have is a group of individuals. You don't, and any teacher knows that the early work is always to try to build a sense of community in that space. But in Reggio, yes, build a sense of community because we are all in community. But to really help all of us understand the interdependence that we have on each other, first and foremost, as learners. As teachers, we are dependent on our students to help us learn to be the best teachers we can be. And so we have to study the way they learn. And as learners, they need each other. And as Carla would say, children learn with and through the ways of learning of others. That is, they watch each other learning and develop new learning strategies by doing that observation. And I always have to keep coming back and saying, because I was a high school teacher most of my career, we're talking about 1, 2, and 3-year-olds, 4 and 5-year-olds. I mean, these are young children, but and again, as Carla would always point out, they were masters at learning. And we needed to study them to see and learn from them the ways of learning as they were learning from each other new ways of learning.
And maybe this connects to, I know I've heard you talk about the questions that have been posed about Reggio makes us rethink the image of the child, the image of the teacher, the image of the school. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the way that Reggio, at least in your mind and perhaps for others, has transformed the image of the child, the image of the teacher, the image of the school.
Yeah, my very first introduction to the schools was a conversation with Amelia Gambetti, who was part of that experience and was in Boston and came to Project Zero and sat with a group of us around a table. And I think in the first 5 minutes, she said, if you want to understand what happens in Reggio, you have to wrestle with the questions that we wrestle with. I thought, great, okay, what are the questions? And she laid them out. What is your image of the child? What is your image of the teacher? And what is your image of the school? It took me a while to really understand that everything I did as an adult with children in classrooms and outside was built on my image of them. And that a whole lot of my image of a child was actually not all that respectful. That is to say, I thought of little children as cute, adorable, charming, difficult, not particularly capable, needing adult supervision, authority, etc. If that's your image of the child, you create classrooms and schools that reflect that. And I think I'm not alone in having many of those ideas. What I came to see over my many visits in Reggio is what an environment is like if your image of the child is, number one, from birth as a citizen, as hugely capable and competent, and especially competent at learning. And that because learning, as Carla pointed out many times, is key to survival. And children are survivors. They need grown-ups and adults. We are interdependent, but they are also hugely capable and working very hard. They talk about children as researchers. And as soon as I started to flip that and hold that lens in my own vision as I was looking at children, I could see them completely differently.
And I know that they talk about children as researchers, but then also teachers need to see themselves as researchers as well. And it was really striking to me when I went into the Reggio classroom, how the image of the teacher was different. Maybe you could say a little bit more about the image of the teacher.
Well, I think that, research is really a kind of what I would call an animating core in the Reggio schools. It infuses everything. It's like comes from the center of the being and infuses all the way out to the farthest reach of the fingertips. Research is the search for, and again, as Carla had said to me many times, and to many others, research is the search for meaning and understanding. And
I
so
would
for
see the
teachers,
dedication. I was very struck with the dedication of the teachers. I remember on my early visits there, I'd be there in the school and see the children interacting in interesting ways. And then at the end of the school day, and I'd go back, and the teachers were putting in a lot of time after school, both documenting what went on, but as you said, searching for meaning of what went on
yeah.
and reflecting on what went on, and then documenting in ways that other people they could share with others so that others could see it. And it was really striking to me, and they just said it's part of the culture that the teachers of Reggio, that's what they see as their role.
Yeah, I think of it. I mean, I'm going to come back to the avant-garde theater idea. First of all, the presence of an atelierista, an artist or craftsperson who works in the school and has a dedicated space, a studio that the children come into, but it's all porous and permeable between the rooms, between the interior and the exterior, between the school and the community. Which is also part of what I love. In American schools, you feel like you're going into a space and you're not going to get out of it till the end of the day or the end of 12 years. There, it's everything is permeable. The 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 role of the artist, it seems to me, is always this kind of, as I said before, a kind of restless experimentation, trying new things, playing and playing with materials in new ways to see what you can do with them, to see what they become and how they can transform and what they can mean.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier, the Making Learning Visible project, which was a collaboration between Reggio and at Harvard, where you were at the time. Uh, Say a little bit about the goals there and how that fit into the Reggio ideas.
Yeah, as I was starting to say, so the main question in the Making Learning Visible project was, when is a group a learning group, and how can you help it, a group of individuals, to become a learning group? What do we mean by a learning group? Uh, when when a group can make things, do things together, or solve problems that none of the individuals could have particularly. So again, my background is in theater and in teaching theater. It's a perfect example. You can't do a play. Yes, there are one-person shows, but they're not really one-person shows. There are a lot of people involved. But in school, when you're making plays with children, uh, everybody has to participate. Everybody has to contribute. And part of the work and the fun of it is finding the particular contributions that each person can make, and supporting them in doing that. In a lot of classrooms, you walk in and you see a lot of individuals doing individual work, being assessed individually. But how can you take that space and help that group, that collection of individuals, to actually be able to learn together? And there are lots of answers to that. I mean, one is give them opportunities and problems to work on that require multiple perspectives and lots of people contributing. And that immediately creates an opening for that kind of interaction in which we can learn together what we need to know in order to solve the problem or to make the sculpture or to make the banners.
I know that part of it is also, although it's only part of documenting the process, but the documentation can then share, which people can then understand and come together because there's a shared artifact to reflect upon. So that documenting of what's happening in the Reggio classrooms that those teachers were doing at the end of the school day is a way to then have something to reflect upon, to bring a group together, and to bring outsiders to come in, the parents to come in to understand what's going on inside the group.
Right, because those conversations at the end of the school day are all in preparation for the next morning.
Yeah,
they're back in the group and they're about to, as they would say, relaunch the project. Sometimes the next day, sometimes a week later, but they would bring the children back. And, part of the way I understand that documentation, Mitch, is why do we, when a family has a special occasion or goes on a trip, why do they take all of those pictures? Well, part of it is to have a record, but so that we can come back and stand around those pictures and say, do you remember when that happened? That's when we were about to go do this, or we had just had this difficult experience, but then we were coming back together. It is in the recreation collectively of a kind of memory of the experience that we've had together that we move from holding that experience as just ours to realizing in that moment we were all part of that, and we all not only contributed to it in the moment, but we contribute to the memory of it. And I think that that's much more important than we kind of give credit to in the formation of the consciousness of the collective and the group.
Yeah. One thing I want to come back to was we talked about the early days of Reggio, that it was started in reaction to the fascism in Italy in 1945. And I think it always stayed close in Carla's mind. She'd always say, educational decisions are always political decisions, that there was sort of a political sense to making all the decisions that came about. And since Carla's passing, I've been thinking about it, the relevancy to today's world, because sadly, 80 years after the founding of the Reggio schools, there's again the rise of authoritarianism. So for me, the ideas that were the founding ideas of Reggio are more relevant today than ever, and more important for us to continue to find ways to help them live on and some of the goals that they had. And one aspect of that comes to my mind comes again from the poem, the 100 Languages poem from Loris Malaguzzi. I'm going to read one other short passage from the poem where Malaguzzi writes, "The child has 100 languages and 100 more, but they steal 99. And for me, that's a really, arresting, comment, that he has in there. And I think he's pointing out that children have all these ways of expressing and exploring, but the schools around them or the societies around them pushed them to conform. They steal 99. And I worry that that's happening in today's society. That for me, some of the most important things today is to make sure that people grow up with the ability to make choices and develop their voices. And I do think the Reggio schools are about that, making choices and developing voices. So for me, trying to keep alive that spirit from the early days of Reggio and what Carla was always calling for, and to make sure that people don't steal the 99 is something that
Yes.
I'm always taking with me now.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I feel the same deep concerns that you feel about this moment that we're in. Uh, Both and I think this is true in Italy, but certainly true here in the U.S. From the banning of books to the assaults on free speech that we see. It does feel absolutely urgent, and it feels especially important to not think of this as something that we take up with young people when they're in high school or college, but something that we take up with young people the moment they come into a social, their first social environment, which is the infant toddler center or the preschool. And again, that free speech is not just about the words you use, but all of the things that you make that express how you see and both see the world, how you see the world as it is, and how you envision the world you want to live in. And I
And
think
that's a key part of civic education. Civic education is not just about how does Parliament pass laws, but the things you were describing, I see as at the core of what civic education really is about.
yeah, Mitch, the on my second visit to Reggio, we were after spending a day in the schools, my colleagues Mara and Ben and I were in a meeting with Carla, but with Tiziana, with Vea, with many of the Atelieristas and Pedagogistas that were working on the project. And I was, honestly breathless. I mean, I just couldn't process what I'd been seeing during the day. It felt very overwhelming. And apparently I said, what is this? We've landed. Where have we landed? What is this, utopia? And Carla's response was, no, this is not utopia. But what is happening here gives us the courage to think of utopia. And for me, that resonates especially in relation to the foundings of these preschools in 1945 in the response to authoritarianism, fascism, and war.
Maybe that's a good lead in to my final question
Sure.
uh, for our conversation is about obviously a lot of people have been inspired and see the schools of Reggio and see them as an interesting model. But what advice would you give people to be able to put some of that into practice? I think we have to acknowledge it's not easy for someone just to see what's happening in Reggio to say, oh, and I'll do it here. What advice would you have to people both about the possibilities, the challenges of trying to take these ideas and make them core to the learning and education of the next generation?
Yeah. Uh, it's a great question and it's a hard question. I think that anyone who has worked in any of the preschools, and we've also worked with teachers K through 12, not just in preschools, who were inspired by Reggio ideas. I think one of the biggest challenges is to try to move beyond the surface of those ideas, what they look like, because the images are absolutely compelling. And so you sort of take those images and you think, well, I want my classroom to look like that. And to try to and to remember that that's what those ideas look like when they manifest in one town in northern Italy, in Reggio Emilia, in their context and in their moment. What you have to then say is, okay, what's the core that I find, the core of that practice. You have to kind of trace it from the surface to the core. Say, what's the core that particularly inspires me? And how would that manifest in my place and in my time, in my community? And then to be very patient, to kind of allow that to emerge and reveal itself in your work with children over time, and your colleagues and parents, etc. But to keep coming back to the core. So if there was a piece of advice there, it would be look at pictures, films. There's a lot of material available and wonderful volumes. Malaguzzi's writings, Carla Rinaldi's writings, Vecchi's writings. Look at those, read them, and see where you get most excited. Take that paragraph and take it to a colleague and say, read this paragraph with me. Let's make sense out of this. Does this excite you as much as it excites me, and why? And how could that be the seed that makes something particular grow and bloom in our own context?
Great. Okay, well, thanks so much. It's been great spending some time sharing ideas, remembering Carla, and also think about how we can help make sure that the ideas that were so meaningful and important to Carla stay alive into the future. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Mitch. Thanks for doing this, and always really a joy to talk with you.
The Lifelong Kindergarten podcast is produced by Mitch Resnick and Eric Schelling in the Lifelong Kindergarten Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. You can find other episodes, additional resources, and online conversation in our Substack at bit.ly/LLK podcast.